section of the housing element has to do with constraints and making sure that we include how long it takes to get a building permit, how much it costs to get a building permit, and any other governmental or non-governmental constraints in terms of making sure there's enough infrastructure to accommodate future growth, and if there's any environmental issues. So that's a more technical section of the document. Then there's the resources and sites inventory, which is we have to provide a land inventory with maps that is a site-by-site parcel analysis that will say, here is all the land available to accommodate single-family and multifamily and duplexes and everything across the board in the document. So we have to do that. Another way that we hope to show that the town can meet its land inventory is through accessory dwelling units, which are second units or ADUs or granny flats. They have a number of names. HCD does, and ABAG has created an ADU calculator so that we can estimate and project out how many ADUs can be approved over the next 8 years. ADUs are not tied to land, so we will have a land inventory, but then we will also project out potential ADUs, and you don't do that on a site-by-site basis. You do it based on the number of building permits you've received, and we can do a calculation to project for the next 8 years. All of this feeds into the policies and programs. So one of the things we also have to do is look at the fifth cycle, the current housing element, and look at everything that was accomplished during this last 8 years and what wasn't accomplished and reasons why things weren't accomplished, and create the narrative for what needs to be carried forward into this next cycle of your housing element. So that's what we call our checks and balances process. There's also a number of new laws that will have to be addressed, as well as any constraints. There's always density bonus program updates, second units. The legislation's changing rapidly, so we want to make sure your zoning code is up to date. So there'll be a number of those kind of items that will be listed in the housing element that you'll do over this next 8-year period. And it's important to note that with the programs, staff has to submit to every year an annual progress report on what has been accomplished and what is in the process, and how many building permits have been issued during that planning period. So we keep that in mind as we're drafting this, because staff has to actually implement it over the next 8 years. Next slide. Next slide. All right, the regional housing needs allocation. So we have talked about this before, but the state comes up with a growth projection number, and it's a regional housing needs determination, which I think is over 2 million. And then that number is then allocated out to all of the councils of governments, in this case, the Association of Bay Area Governments, which received a little less than 500,000 units. And then ABAG puts together a methodology for how to assign out all of those units to all the 109 cities and the counties within the ABAG region. So we have included what your fourth cycle was, which was 87, and there were actually 101 units constructed that year. It's also important to look at what was constructed versus what your allocation is. The fifth cycle was done almost 8 years ago almost, and it was coming out of a recession. So everyone's allocation was much, much smaller at that point. So the fifth cycle was 17 total units, and you did end up constructing 21 units during that 8-year period. So now we're looking at 72 units for planning for 72 units over this next period. It is not the job of the town to build them. It is the job of the town to show that the land is available, as well as to help facilitate programs and make sure that there are no constraints to actually developing housing. Next slide. So again, the state RHNA process is a state required process, and each jurisdiction gets a allocation of units, ours being 72, and it is, as I mentioned, not a mandate to construct the units. It's a mandate that show, again, sites as well as programs to help facilitate the development. Next slide. Here's a breakdown of how Napa County's RHNA allocation is broke down. So you can see Yountville was assigned 2% of the overall growth, being that most of it went to the city and the second highest being the unincorporated area of the county. So now, when we look at RHNA and we are planning for these 72 units, and we're looking at them, and some of them are market rate and some of them are what is considered high density or a multifamily type product, we also have to do an evaluation of what your income is and what the income level of the county is. So for Napa County, it's done on a countywide basis. The median income for a family of 4 is $109,200. So when we're looking at the lower income portion of the RHNA, we also have to look at what those income levels are and who that population is that we would be planning for in terms of housing, the workforce potentially housing. So as you see, starting at the bottom is the low income. So they make 80% of that 109,000. Anyone in the Napa County region making less than 90,000 for a family of 4 is considered lower income, which for Yountville equates to 41% of the population is in the lower income categories, meaning they're making less than that 90,000. And that's based on a family of 4. There's a whole matrix that will be in the document, so it'll show each family for a family of 2, a family of 1, so on and so on. So we do equate what occupations those would potentially be within the region, and so this is the list. So when we're looking at the low income, it's potentially a graphic designer or a mail carrier. The very low income is personal aides and vet assistants, wine salespersons. And then extremely low is a little bit trickier because it's harder to build that, but it's also the population that is basically one paycheck away from homelessness. So that would be part-time employees or Social Security, people on very fixed incomes, that if they didn't have that one income, they could be in the process of losing their house. So those are the way that we kind of equate that, and we have to show that analysis in the housing element. Next slide. When I talk density, so the state equates density to income, which is the only way that they can show it within the housing element. So Yountville is considered a suburban jurisdiction, less than 25,000 population. So when we show in the land inventory what units are count towards that lower income, those multifamily, we're looking at a 20 unit an acre density. More larger metropolitan areas are 30 units. So we're looking at 20 units per acre. Now this slide just shows basically the 72 units broken out by the income categories. So of the 30 units of the lower income, there is the affordable housing overlay zone that does allow 20 to 25, and we'll talk more about that. That currently allows multifamily high density in the overlay zone. Moderate income would be duplexes, attached houses, mixed use, all those types of things. And then above moderate is all your single family. So on the right-hand column, we just included from your zoning code where we would show those designations with what land is available. Next slide. We do like to check ourselves with this, and so as we talked about, your 5th cycle RHNA goal was 17. You actually ended up doing 21 building permits during that time. There were no very low or low units built, but there were a few moderate, and the majority, well, one more being above moderate. So, but this is something, again, that staff will track on an annual basis and report back to council on what the progress is of meeting the RHNA each year. Okay, so we have been working with staff since December on vacant land sites. So we do kind of an exhaustive list, and we try to come up with everything that's a possibility. So you'll see the Washington and Weber, Washington Street, the church site, and then the 2 on Humboldt, and then the 1 on Jefferson. So right now, this is what we have for vacant land and how to make that work and build the case for these sites. Next slide. These are kind of just more of a close-up of it. We would be looking at a portion of, well, we have where the number 2 designated is the portion of that site that we would be looking at, not the whole site. We would be looking at a portion of it to count towards meeting the RHNA. So the kind of the check and balance system here is, again, the church site being, as you can see, the asterisk there on number 2 is that it's actually 16 acres, but we're only counting 4.5 acres of it due to floodplain constraints possibilities. So what will be included in the housing element is like we said, an address and a parcel listing and acreage, and we have to show what sites can accommodate what income levels. So that based on what we've pulled from your land inventory and your zoning code and your general plan, there is a capacity for 105 units over this next 8-year period. Yeah.
I can just interrupt real quickly. And Eddie, could you go back to that aerial shot? Just to be clear, because we've all heard this quite a bit,
yeah,
especially those of us on the housing committee. Number one is just to describe it in layman's terms, the French Laundry Garden site.
Sorry, yes.
Number 1. Number 2 is the planted vineyard area at the Catholic Church site at the
Correct.
South end of town. We're only talking about the portion that's west of the creek, I believe. Isn't that the separator there?
Right, the little, where the number 2 is.
Right, and then the other 2 are actual residential parcels. The number 5 is at the very north end of town, and numbers 3 and 4 are more in the middle, south middle part of town. Okay.
Thank you. So previously we have worked to try to consider the veterans home. We have had meetings with the state about the status of the veterans home, and at our last public workshop, the mayor has more information than I probably do on this, but due to the uncertainty of it, it makes it difficult. HCD wants to see certainty, and when they want to see certainty, it means that they want to know that someone can come into the planning department tomorrow and actually pull a building permit to actually build a unit. There is not that current certainty we can give them on actual development occurring on the veterans home, and so while it will hopefully continue, be counted possibly in the next round, or if something does happen within this period, it will count towards your RHNA, because again, staff has to report on that every year. But in terms of showing certainty that it could happen, we're not going to include it in the inventory. The same with the Yountville Elementary School. There's a lot of political factors in place and not enough certainty that those projects will actually move forward. So it's more of a difficult sell with the state, and that is something they're very focused on this round, whereas we could kind of say, yes, these are both things that could happen. We can't provide them the level of detail that they want at this point. So while they're out there, we're not relying on them to meet this RHNA based on the other sites that we have listed. We do have a surplus, as I mentioned, of 44 units. So we're working through, we have to make some modifications that Christy's going to be coming back to you with, and she can provide more on that, but I'll get to some of that when we get to that point. Right, so some of the laws that I'm speaking of have to do with providing more certainty, and doing that is, there's more laws called AB 1397, and that's one of them. That is that we have to tie income levels to the sites, and we have to show what the lease is and who owns it and how you can get a building permit and all those things that we can't do on those particular sites right now. But in addition, this list is very lengthy, and it is all the new laws that have come into place since your last housing element 8 years ago. So it's made our job a little bit more challenging, so to speak, of all these new things that need to be addressed. So when I mentioned there'll be a few minor zoning code revisions of things that need to get done, Kirsty's going to be bringing some of that forth to you to get some of these things in place and done. And we had a community workshop. So first off, on that day, we did have let me back up. We did do stakeholder consultations because we started a lot of these housing elements when we were earlier into the pandemic and people were not doing outreach meetings and certainly not in-person outreach meetings, we started contacting service providers, and you can see the list here. And this was something that the state really liked because we need information from these service providers of what the needs of their clients are. And so that helps to populate the housing element of what the needs of the community are. And so we have done one-on-one interviews with each of these service providers, and there'll be analysis in the housing element to show the needs, and we tie that to programs in the document. Then we also had a virtual community workshop on February 16th, and then we had an in-person workshop on March 2nd. On March 2nd, we also had a meeting with the chamber and hospitality businesses and local organizations. We had that at the community center. And then we have been meeting with the ad hoc housing steering committee to kind of go through and talk about some of these sites and ways that we can get there to meet your RENA. And then subsequently, we did do the study session with the CDRB early on. That was a joint meeting with you. And then we will be coming back in July, I'll get to that, with the draft because it has to go out for review. So back on the meetings, the first in-person stakeholder meeting was that afternoon. We had a really great discussion with the hospitality owners and the local stakeholders talking about how many of your staff actually live in Yountville. Not many. How many? Is it because they can't afford it? That seemed to be a trend. So there was discussion with some of the stakeholders of, well, what about a housing trust fund? Is that something that we can do? Is that something that local employers can pay into to help to provide housing for their staff who want to live in Yountville? So I think it was a good start, a very beginning start to a conversation that will continue to happen. And the chamber was very involved, and I think they have some great ideas that they're going to continue to move forward, as well as the acknowledgement in the housing element. That evening, we had the community workshop and gave a presentation, and as I mentioned, the mayor is very well-versed on the Veterans Home site and the status on that, so there was a good discussion on that and how that could work. We did a number of stations. I'm going to go to the next slide. One of them being housing preference. And so while you can't see this, there'll be more information in the document about it. But basically, it's always a good check-in to see where people are currently living and what are their preferences. Is it to continue staying in single-family homes, which was predominantly the case here, but mobile homes, senior housing was another suggestion. So we got a few dots. Accessory dwelling units. There has been more ADU talk and allowing for more ADUs as another way of bringing people into the community. So, all right, the project schedule. Oh, so next up. So while we are making some, as I mentioned, Kirsty will be back with some zoning code amendments that she's going to introduce to you. We do need to make a few minor modifications to the overlay, the affordable housing overlay, to make sure that it meets some of the new state requirements, and then allowing it to make sure that it does say that it allows 20 units an acre. So there's a few things that we need to tweak to it to make sure, as I mentioned, because of the default density, because of the way the state is working. And then we have to do some zoning changes to the Catholic Church to bring that into compliance so that can continue to count towards meeting your RENA. So one of the new laws with the housing element, and that's referred to as AB 215, is that you have to release the draft housing element for 30 days. During that 30-day review, we will come back to you with the draft to show you the draft that will then be authorized. So it's 30-day review. Then if you receive comments, if advocates or residents write comments on the draft, it has to then be released for an additional 10 days. So 30 plus 10 is the 10 business days. So they do add that business days to that last 10 days. So then a few days for us to clean it up and get it off to the HCD for review. So again, July 19th will be the time for you to review and authorize us to submit it to the state to get the ball rolling with their 90-day review. all of this adds 4 months of kind of sitting around and waiting. So just prepping you for how all that will go. And I think lastly, is the schedule. Last slide is the bigger schedule. So again, starting that review in June, bringing it back to you in July, and then getting it off for that first review. We also included a second 60-day review just based on the climate of how things are going right now, bringing it back for adoption in January, and then submitting it for that additional 60-day review that we have to do for certification. Any questions?
Thank you for the presentation. Council questions? Anybody? Vice Mayor?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, and the slides were good.
Once we got them.
Once we got them going. I was wondering about, for example, just as an example, the church property owned by the Diocese of Napa, for negotiating with the property owners to talk about, okay, I can tell that the town managers.
We can read your mind.
I can read where you're, I think what's important, and there's two parts to, I think, where you're to make outreach efforts to have dialogue with the diocese. Prior to the pandemic, we had been working with their finance director who retired, working with the church to either lease or work with a developer is a second thing, and both are going on.
And does that need to take place with each of the identified, for example, the French Laundry Garden and also other, yes, so it has to go on.
Housing is related to that rezoning so that I think if you may recall, Planning Director Shelton talked about the historical 11 to 13 units that were a part of when for example, the hotel project came forward.
Right.
So that's just what you're hearing from Jennifer and Kirsty is that we have a few things that we have to do just to codify those things and then to continue. So all of those are in play. Okay. And if something, and what you're also seeing is something could break on the veterans home, which could be very positive, but we can't count it right now. No. So I want the council and the community to know that your staff is working on about 4 different possibilities, and that's all they are right now are possibilities, because we have to have a willing property owner and partner, but there are people interested, and we're continuing to work to build those coalitions. And it could very well be a coalition that ends up doing something at the Catholic Church site of some of the business owners and other parties, as well as the nonprofit sector. So, I mean, that's the most promising it's been in a long time.
And then I did have one more question, and that is,
to address that. So we have the 72 units of RENA, and what we're showing is a surplus that you have additional sites. There is a law that is called no net loss. So if a project comes forward on you as a council, more ability and flexibility to approve projects, what happens with some jurisdictions is that if you have a RENA of 72 and we show that there's only 72, and then something comes forward on one of those sites that doesn't meet that RENA that we've identified, you would fall.
Other than having more housing available.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that
Thank
was
you. That
your
was-
question.
yeah.
I also wanted to point out all the sites you've identified either are currently zoned for housing,
Correct.
or in the case of the French Laundry Garden site, has a housing obligation attached to
correct.
it, even though it's no. And there's an explanation, a little bit of the definition of fair housing. Is it clear what that element means when we talk about having fair housing as part of the needs assessment?
My snarky response is it's clear as mud, but
Well, it's from the state, so.
yeah, so the state came out with there's schools and there's public transit and there's services, and then we overlay race and ethnicity and overcrowding and income levels on all the maps in the
30 in those two categories in this next cycle, if I saw 19 and 11.
You start over, so we just
No, I
have
understand,
the
but I mean,
72. Yeah,
It doesn't matter how many we didn't do then.
correct.
We need 19, we had 0, now we need 19.
Correct.
We had 0 in the low, and we need 11. and then we have others that are above moderate. We were over our minimum requirement for moderate and above moderate,
Right,
but we did not satisfy the two lowest, which are
Correct.
always the most challenging
correct.
to build at somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000 a unit.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Councilmember Tagliabashi?
One question to follow up to the mayor's question. Thank you very much. Great presentation, by the way. I appreciate it. So is there no penalty for not meeting that low or very low number? Maybe I
So
missed that
that's
part
a
of the
good
presentation.
question. There is always legislation being proposed for that, but the long and the short of it, and I'm sure the attorney can also chime in here, is that there is, as I mentioned, you are not a developer. The town shows land and shows that you have programs to help facilitate it. So if you don't build it, there's not a necessarily penalty. The only thing that has come into play is SB 35, which has to do with streamlining of housing projects. So specifically on, I believe, the church site that was previously counted in the last 2 cycles, we're counting it again. And what that means is that if an affordable housing project came in that included 20% affordable, then it would have to be approval through the planning department, a ministerial approval process. It would not go to a hearing process. So SB 35 is similar in streamlining. So when you don't do certain portions of your arena, you get put into these buckets or categories that are, I believe you're in the probably 10 or 15%. So if a project came in at 15, maybe it's 15 or 20%. Again, if a project came in that included, this would be an owner worked with a developer and came in and said, we're gonna do 20% affordable, then it would be, and they apply for SB 35, then it would be streamlined through the planning department. Is that, do you wanna correct me?
No, I agree with all that. There have been proposals at the state level to prevent the town and other jurisdictions, in the event you don't meet these requirements, to prevent you from collecting or imposing impact fees and other revenue sources and things like that as a penalty for not meeting these, but those have not been signed into law. Similar proposals do get introduced every year as part of housing packages, but as of right now, it is the SB 35 streamlined process for certain affordable projects. To the extent that application came in and these were not met, then yes, there would be a more streamlined ministerial approval for those projects, and it wouldn't come before the council.
And the other thing that occasionally is in play is the state has also threatened to take away your building permit issuance approval if you are in default on your housing element. So they are starting to put more energy into the consequences of not
It's the enforcement
being
department.
successful.
Right. Well, and there are multiple legal challenges in cities that have tried to get around the new Senate Bill 9 requirements for housing. So there are punitive actions in place, and the state has sued cities already and have threatened to, is it transportation dollars they were going to hold back
Yeah.
for failure to have
That's
certified
correct.
housing elements?
That's correct,
Yeah.
yeah.
Councilmember.
One more follow-up for those of us who don't play in
Don't
your
speak
world and
this
don't
language, I
understand the
understand.
ministerial process. Can you kind of describe what the
Ministerial
normal
would
process would be?
be
and-
a site plan would go to Kirsty and it would go, as long as the site plan met the setbacks and the height and all, it met your zoning code and your general plan standards, then your planning department would give approval to it. So
No
ministerially,
ZDRB, no council
No.
needed? Okay, thank you.
other than design.
Yeah, I just want to make that clear for
Thank
folks that
you.
are listening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
And that's the similar situation with ADUs. The state has basically taken away authority on much of design
yeah.
and other elements of ADU in the spirit of creating more housing units.
Correct.
Yeah. Any other Councilmember Knight?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you again for your presentation. So on one of these charts, you talk about our sixth cycle surplus, the 44 units. When you provide the first draft to HCD, do do you have to specifically identify those surplus sites? Will that be on the report?
Correct. It will be all of the sites. We'll include all 105 sites.
Locations? and
Correct.
they'll have
Yes,
to be
by
specifically
by
identified
assessor
on the
parcel
report.
and by map.
All right, good,
Yes.
thank you.
I think those are the questions from council. Any member of the public have a question on this presentation? Eddie, did we receive any public comment?
We did not, Mayor.
Okay. Kirsty, anything else? As you just reseated?
I just wanted to share that the trend for all housing, besides a single-family home, is being trended to this ministerial process. So we took our objective development and design standards and had a lengthy conversation at the last CDRB in preparation to multiple zoning amendments that we will be bringing to you in May. It will also include ZDRB's recommendation in looking at these objective standards for some of these ministerial housing developments.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder also, one of the challenges of the ministerial approval, if it were to go to that level, we have very little to say about height limits, density. As long as it's meeting the thresholds that are required, then that it gets a little scary for us to be that out of control of a development project that might happen here. So that's sufficient motivation to make this all happen. Okay, thank you. Yes, oh, you do have public comment, please. I need you to come up to the podium, please. Thank you. Hold on, before you start, just because people are watching.
Will you
Be able to hear
mind
you.
stating
Great,
your
thank
name as
you.
well for the record?
Name is Mark Pandone. So, again, a question regarding the process of environmental and infrastructure. If it goes to this other process that's outside of that, how do they assess the ability of the local town or city to supply those things?
So the act of the housing element will actually do the environmental analysis in regards to CEQA, in regards to utilities, and then as part of our recent zoning ordinance effort, we've cast these development and design standards. ZDRB did a deeper dive last week, so what'll come to you in the second meeting in May will be a comprehensive analysis of all of those. Coming for you, and also in May would include that environmental analysis to increase the density of the Catholic Church site to allow for that type of development. Did that adequately answer your question?
I'm going to ask a follow-up to, if I also heard ministerial approval, I'll say, would still need to follow some of those criteria you just outlined, CEQA, environmental impacts.
Absolutely.
Those would still have to happen. But those are kind of state rules or
Well,
not so much town.
Don't be too scared. Our development and design standards are very thorough. You have to have a porch. You have to have a certain roof pitch. We have a lot of detail into it. Basically, you can't deny it if it doesn't meet certain standards. But you still have to meet these design and development standards that you guys did a great job in your Zoto effort. And ZDRB took a second look at. We have these fabulous spreadsheets that are easy for both an applicant and for staff to analyze. We have 30 days to determine if it complies and let the applicant know. So we will still be reviewing it. It's not just going to be an automatic yes. There are, detailed development standards that they'll have to abide by.
And Gary's leaning forward.
Yeah, just one clarification on that. For ministerial approval, CEQA won't apply because it applies to discretionary projects. So for these types of projects to go through, they do need to comply with the objective standards in the code. There are those that include in Title 17, but it does go through a much more streamlined process, including a CEQA review.
But to have complete control of it, as complete as we can, we're going to have a certified housing element that explains all this in great detail.
Correct.
Yes. Yes, Councilmember Integrity Bosch.
I think just to clarify one more point, and Director Shelton, thank you very much. I think what you're saying is your analysis is going to include the impact on the roads and the infrastructure of 71 or potentially a few more additions to the community, and that analysis will be in the report and answer this gentleman's questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, in both the rezone that you'll see before the housing element and then ultimately in the housing element.
Great, thank you. Yes,
So your general plan and your recent general plan EIR is what we're tearing off the environmental review for. So the development of these 72 units is well within the build out of town. So that is where the environmental information lies. An addendum is just basically a reference back to your general plan EIR. So that's how we're covering that.
And just as a reminder for everybody, we are a principally built-out community, which is why, from an infill standpoint, CEQA generally is not going to, our projects aren't going to trigger a large CEQA impact, as opposed to perhaps a project in the unincorporated county or other areas where you have large tract of undeveloped property. That's just not Yountville's case. So from that standpoint, the largest undeveloped property is the church property, and it's been accounted for in the last two general plan updates.
okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and seeing you in person. It's been year plus of Zoom meetings. All right, we're going to move on to item 10B. Consider adopting resolution number 22-4115, approving the use of fiscal year 2021-2022 annual budget contingency for a budget adjustment to increase general fund finance department contract services in the amount of $50,000 to initiate the 2022 utility rate study. And there you are. You already made it back just in the amount of time it took me to read that. Celia, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Town Council. So this request before you today is to approve a budget adjustment in the amount of $50,000 to initiate the 2022 utility rate study. The most recent utility rate study was approved in 2018, and the last rate increase from the 5-year schedule was implemented on January 1st, 2022. This utility rate study is important, as without it, utility rates remain the same, which does not serve the enterprise funds as far as helping them achieve the specific goals that are outlined in the staff report. There was a question raised about the funding request, and there is another option for funding this utility rate study that really should have been included in the staff report as an alternative for council to consider. So I apologize for not having included that. I did email you all yesterday about it, but I did want to also include it in the presentation, that it would be appropriate for council to direct staff to fund the utility rate study from the enterprise funds. So the way that would work is that the cost of the study would be split 50-50 between the water fund and the wastewater fund. And then the wastewater portion would then be split again between the wastewater collection and wastewater treatment departments. And this is how the 2018 utility rate study was funded. So if council should choose this option, staff would revise the proposed resolution to reflect a budget adjustment in the applicable water and wastewater operating departments, so that the cost of the utility rate study would be covered by the enterprise funds rather than the general fund. So I think that is up for discussion, as well as any other questions about the staff report that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Councilmember Moeller.
Thank you very much for that, and I will confess I was the one who made that question. So thank you for looking into that. So regarding that option, if we do choose to go with that option, what that would essentially do, it will have all the ratepayers, including the veterans home, actually, so everyone would be paying their fair share. But if we left it in the general fund, then all the ratepayers, including the veterans home, wouldn't be paying. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? We'll go Councilmember Knight, and we'll come back to the Vice Mayor.
Thank you. So my question in terms of the payment for the utility rate study, I understand that the town's policy is that the general fund shouldn't provide direct subsidies for the rates and the cost of service. But so in 2018, this study was funded within the enterprise fund, but I could also see in terms of what you provided here is that funding it through the general fund is really a way for, by funding it through the general fund, I guess the council's policy of wanting to promote timely studies and review would allow it to come out of a contingency fund. Is that correct? I mean, is it?
Well, it is in the finance department scope within the general fund to conduct studies, such as a rate study I think would be applicable, and an impact fee study, for example.
So if we do fund it out of the enterprise funds, is that put any of those particular funds into additional deficit, or are there?
The water fund is currently operating in a deficit at this point, so the water fund's portion of the study would be $25,000 approximately, so it would add another $25,000 to the deficit.
Okay, thank you.
Hold on.
That
Vice
was my
Mayor.
question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Mueller?
But it's also possible, if we decide to keep it in the enterprise funds, that even though one's in a deficit, it could still be essentially paid for by the general fund, and then using a loan, you could basically then charge the water fund when there were sufficient funds to pay back that loan.
I think there's potential to loan from the general fund and pay it back.
So it's a way of not taking a deficit farther, but
Correct.
actually going ahead and signing a contract and getting it going, but then keeping it in the enterprise fund so everyone pays their fair share of all the users.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, you were leaning forward. I assumed that meant
Well, I just want
you're going
to,
to speak.
without getting too far on a topic that's not directly on the agenda, finance directors indicated that due to the cost escalation and the drought and the cost of water, that we are experiencing a slight deficit. So at some point, we may need to come for a small cleanup and a loan. So at this point, my thought to you all is adding the 25,000 now, and then we'll have a better sense. The other thing I want to remind everybody is that we really don't have a choice not doing the rate study, because if we don't do the rate study, the rates stay as they are, and that's not going to be sustainable, especially for water. And we actually have some good news without, we have reason to believe that the efforts that we made in the last rate study to really focus attention on wastewater have benefited us. So the good news there is that the level of rate increase for the wastewater fund will not be as significant as they were. Unfortunately, the cost of water that we purchase is increasing and increasing. And I'm going to be very clear with everybody, because this is reservoir water math. So under our agreement with the state, we basically pay 50% of the operating cost of the reservoir maintenance and the water treatment. And that's regardless of the amount of water we get. So right now we are getting 20% less water, which means on an acre foot basis, the cost is now going to be in the neighborhood of 1,400 to 1,600 an acre feet. And when we last started the last rate cycle, we were in the 700 an acre feet range. So really the cost for water is all about our purchase. The town does not mark up the water cost, and that's why we have three distinct rates. We have the system fee, which is basically what it costs us to maintain and operate staff, the distribution that's in the line. We have a smaller system replacement fee that we build money towards being able to maintain, and then you have a commodity charge. So just want to kind of get that out there. But yes, I think more than likely you will see early in the year us coming back with a more comprehensive look at where we see the water enterprise fund at, and it probably won't surprise you that I may actually suggest that you borrow out of the water drought reserve rather than the general fund to keep it in the enterprise family. But those are some things that I think will be better prepared when we have an understanding of how we're ending the fiscal year, and we have sufficient cash flow to manage this at this point.
So Celia, do we have a history of loaning any of the utility funds out of,
General
General.
fund? No, I don't believe so.
okay, Vice Mayor?
Yeah, so given the cost of water is growing exponentially, isn't it more important to keep that money in the Water Enterprise Fund to pay for it? Or do we pay for that out of the general fund?
Right now, the council's approved policy is there is no general fund subsidy. So that's where I would say using the loan from the drought reserve fund would be, one, consistent with that policy. And previously, if you may recall, we do have a small loan for the emergency Washington Park water repairs. So, I mean, that's consistent with that approach. And then obviously, one of the effects of the utility rate study will be figuring out how much is necessary to resolve the small operating deficit and then, look at our operating costs going forward. So it's going to be a footnote, but one that we think is reasonable and appropriate in that point.
So you're suggesting that we take the loan out of the contingency fund, the water contingency fund?
Drought contingency
Drought
fund, when we come to that point, that is, like I say, at this point, if the council, and certainly it's consistent with the council policy and direction, to have the rate study funded by the utility enterprise fund. So our recommendation would be that you make that change to the resolution, approve it, and then to the extent necessary, at a future date, we will bring back whatever might be necessary in a bridge loan for the water.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Any other council questions?
Mayor,
Councilmember Knight?
thank you. I'm fine with either way. I'm also could be supportive of the staff's initial recommendation because we're not direct, this is not a direct subsidy to the rates, but just for the study. But whatever the council supports, I'm happy to fund it in either manner. Thank you.
I'm going to invite any member of the public that might have a comment before we continue deliberating. Anyone in the audience? And I don't believe we received any email correspondence on this item. Is that correct?
We didn't, Mayor.
Okay. So if there's further discussion or if there's a motion to be made, I'll entertain that. Did you have a motion, Councilmember Waller?
I do have a motion, but just one quick question before that. So, because my motion is going to be that we should keep all direct and indirect costs for our enterprise funds within those funds, so we can figure out, where to get that. So, well, maybe I'll just make my motion, and then I do have another question, I suppose.
You may not need to ask the question if you
Well, that's true.
get your motion.
Well, let me make a statement then. I really hate taking stuff out of this water emergency. We sold off the estate water rights. This water's here. We're kind of in an emergency. So this is going to be a short period of time. I'd really like to, it's not a lot of money. I don't want this paid back over 10 years. I want it, we can resolve this within 6 months or a year at the most once we do the rate study and the rates go up. So I will make a motion that we pay for the rate utility study out of the appropriate water and the wastewater. And then since the water is in a deficit, that we only then borrow $25,000 out of the water contingency fund, and we factor it in year one rates. It's not a lot of money. It'll be a rounding error. That's my motion.
Councilmember Tagliaboschi?
I will second that, but I do have a comment. So I would be interested in our workshop to discuss the the addition of the Vets Home personnel that are driving these water costs to make sure that, I know we have had this discussion many times, so I'd be interested in kind of continuing that discussion to help us better understand where those costs are coming from to make sure that we're paying the appropriate cost for the Vets Home people. So I will second that motion.
Okay, we do have a motion and a second. Are we clear on the motion and the details of the motion? In terms of the source of any potential
Yes, Mayor,
funding
I
of
am.
this?
And you
Okay.
can redo the resolution based on this motion if it passes.
Correct.
Okay. Any further discussion? We have a motion and a second. So the motion, Councilmember Moeller, second by Councilmember Tagliabashi. If clerk will just manually enter those.
You should see the vote open now.
I'm watching yours to see if mine's coming up. None of us see anything yet.
Can you try to refresh one more
I
time?
just did refresh and it came up, so
All right.
just go ahead and
so
refresh in
let's-
the upper part of your,
there's my refresh button.
does everybody have your voting display?
Nope. Mine, I'll refresh one more time. My internet's good.
So we'll just have a verbal from Councilmember Moeller. We have some electronic votes, but all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? So it is unanimous. Thank you for
Thank
filling
you.
in the one. Very good. So that does pass. And thank you for bringing the option forward. Next up, item 10C, feedback and discussion regarding development of a potential accessory dwelling unit or ADU incentive program for ADU rental as affordable housing.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. I'm going to be very brief on this. The idea here was to gauge council interest in additional staff work and effort regarding our goal of trying to come up with incentives to create affordable dwelling units that would be available for both deed restricted, affordable, and/or workforce. So the premise, in the staff report, I talk a bit about some of the sample out of Santa Cruz and a model there that they used as a forgivable loan. Friday was an interesting day. I took the day off and the county sends me a bunch of information about a staff report that they're working on ADUs. And I get a phone call from the new planning director out of Santa Cruz that says they're actually moving towards loan grants rather than the forgivable loan. So the good news is there's a lot of conversation, and I think what I want to highlight a little bit, I did share with you part of the county staff report. The county is going to, was considering today and spending part of their American Rescue Act money to do some more extensive work on ADUs, a combination of things. One, technical assistance grants to provide some partnership with Redwood Credit Union on a loan and grant program, as well as partnerships with the Napa Sonoma ADU to provide technical design, maybe come up with some preordained modified sites and variety of things. So I'm going to be, one, seeking some feedback, but it would appear to me that based on what we're seeing, it's going to make sense for us to go talk to the county, find out a little bit more. And I think what I want to share with you is that we, based on some earlier conversations, the council, we know that we feel that there might be one or two ADUs a year that homeowners might be interested. So I think we want to continue to work on coming up with an incentive program, whether it's a grant, again with a condition of some type of deed restriction timeline for that intended purpose. There are also some programs where there's a rent assistance, so that if somebody rents the property to an appropriate person, there may be an additional grant that small grant on an annualized basis they get for renting to that. So the good news is there's some energy out there. The other good news is that we have some funding in our Measure S affordable and oversight that we could allocate towards a program. So that's my kind of a Reader's Digest update for you, knowing that the council had previously expressed interest. So this is something your staff will see where the county is at. We've had some technical assistance with the City of Napa Housing Authority. So we're comfortable that if the council is interested, we can certainly come up with either a grant, a forgivable loan, or maybe both options and work on something and bring back to you. But as typical when we have some topics like this, our strategy is to try to get some council input before we just go do it and bring it to you. So that's where we're at today, and obviously, given our current conversation with the housing element, it would also be nice if we're able to, by maybe July, have a draft program that the council can approve so that it can be included as part of our package that we take or send to HCD. So based on your feedback, we'll go work and bring something back.
Yeah, and I'm going to add a little bit to what I was hearing, listening to the Board of Supervisors meeting this morning, and it was a very good and very thorough presentation from staff. They included several members of the Napa-Sonoma ADU organization because they are doing very similar work over there. A couple points I want to make real quickly that I jotted down from that presentation. They're talking about having a credit rating element that's required if there is a loan program. They're in a different funding structure with American Rescue funds versus what we'd be talking about potentially loaning people towns resources. So that's just one element I think the staff should be looking into. Also, there is a partnership between Redwood Credit Union and Napa Valley Community Foundation on construction loan, an element of construction loans in the program that would allow some homeowners that may not qualify for capital loans to get them for ADU construction, up to $300,000 in construction financing. So I think those are things that we should consider, whether those dollar amounts are the same or not. And also I shared with a couple of members of the board our concept of to ensure public rental and not just an extension of a family residence, which we've seen repeatedly in town, that this be an incentive that we're proposing today for 10 or 20 years, and the elements of a forgivable loan if they retain the below market rent to members of the public. So sharing some good ideas, I think collectively this all will make a better end result. So anyway, other comments, thoughts about the staff report? Councilmember Moeller and then Tagliabashi.
First, I'm very supportive of a program. I'm not really sure what, the elephant's going to look like yet, but I think between the town staff report and what we're seeing from a bit of Napa County, although that's a little bit different in the Napa-Sonoma, we can probably craft something. And just to follow up on the mayor's point, I think that's kind of my only thing that I think we all have to get a little creative how we work that out, just so we really make sure these ADUs that we're loaning money on are truly going to workforce housing or going to count, towards some of our arena numbers. So, because right now with all of our affordable units, we have the Napa Valley Housing Authority really administering the whole thing. So if they would be willing to administer all that, I'm fine with that. If we have to do it, do we really have maybe we need to think about a part-time compliance officer and how they would look into it, and maybe if somebody has a grandson that really needs a place to live, but all of that really, we have to monitor that to make
This
sure
is
it's all
actually,
equitable. So
if you
that
will,
would
yeah.
be my scope of making sure
This
that
would be consistent, not with Napa Valley Community Housing, but this would be consistent with some of the technical advice and oversight that we receive from the City of Napa Housing Authority. Now, I say that if we start doing 5 or more of these, that may have an impact on our housing consultant services agreement, but we've had very preliminary conversations with them. The city of Napa has a program. They may be revising it. So again, the synergy potentially here is if there is some jurisdictional cleaning up and, figuring out processes that can be then shared, that could expedite things. So, but yes, I think you're spot on, Councilmember Moeller. We do not have the technical experience on staff to do that. We certainly can do the cursory coordination, but City of Napa Housing Authority is versed. That they administer a similar program for City of Napa, and it would be part of our technical assistance contract, which you also just earlier today approved on the consent calendar. So yes, we're with you on that regard.
I'll just add to that,
Okay.
again, the county and their relationship with the Napa-Sonoma ADU organization, extensive technical support
Okay.
and staff support presented to the county. That's why we should be talking to the county and see if there is synergy there that satisfies that.
And there will. Just so you all are aware, we've actually had conversations with Napa-Sonoma ADU as well.
Okay.
Councilmember Tagliabashi?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to the town manager and staff. I think this is a great idea. I think, especially considering what we talked about in the last on the last agenda item with RENA and affordable housing and the built-out environment, any creative ways that we can help incentivize people to maximize their footprint and maybe provide some additional affordable housing. I think that's a great idea. I think that we should celebrate that and figure out how to do that. So very supportive to see what comes from that and hoping to be able to shape something that people can use for decades going forward.
One of the other elements to the presentation this morning, and I don't remember from which organization, but basically prefabbed ADUs that are significantly less expensive. Right now, this morning they were quoting over $600,000 for a housing unit. These would be in the $100,000 to $200,000 range, like all in, with infrastructure, connections, and everything. Basically, a manufactured ADU brought in and predetermined what size. I don't know if that fits exactly what we might need, but it's certainly an option to consider. Greatly reduces the cost to the property owner. Also, it speeds up the availability of the housing unit significantly. So those are, again, elements that we would like, I think.
Right.
You're hearing support from the council to continue putting together a more complete program.
And I would also just share on the comment you're making, Mayor, is ADUs come in different flavors. So you have the pre-manufactured or something that can be plopped into an existing backyard. It's going to be site-specific as to, one, does the homeowner have enough property to put it in? And certainly we can support that. And it may very well be that our program has different elements, a loan of this amount for this type and a grant of this amount and options that we can partner. The good news is there is synergy on getting information sharing and trying to collectively. And I think the more that we can work on those as a region, the more that we can do. One of the things that we do know that we're going to have to revisit is some of our ADUs are going to have to be integrated into the house or garage or above the garage. So we may have to review some of our current thoughts on that. And also, those are going to be more expensive, as the mayor pointed out. They have to be designed and integrated into the existing house. But again, it may be, there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all, and we need to develop a program that could potentially support what different option might make sense for the homeowner that's interested.
Right. Vice Mayor, did you have something?
Yes, please. I just wanted to say that I wholeheartedly support this idea, and I like the idea of developing a grant program with the Measure S funds. I think that that's a very good use for that money. And I do like the idea of some of them manufactured. I've been watching that too, some of them are quite attractive. So anyway, I'm all for it.
And I would just suggest that if we're talking about grants, then these units really do need to be publicly rented and below market. That would be my strong recommendation as you're putting this all together.
I concur.
Other comments, Councilmember Knight?
Mayor, I just want to add my support for the town participating in the regional program. And as you mentioned, there's, the good news is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's multiple organizations for the last few years that have been working on ADUs, and this county staff report was extensive and had some interesting suggestions for best practices. So I look forward to seeing what the town can put together. Thank you.
Okay, so you received proper direction? Do you need an actual motion on this? I don't think so. We're not spending any money yet. Okay. We all agree. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Very good. I don't see any staff informational reports. Have there been any added to?
Nope.
Okay. We're going to move on to meeting reports. I have no report from flood control. Do we have an Upper Valley Waste Management Authority update?
Yes, we met yesterday, and first, one of the announcements, we had basically, there's a lot of different things going on all around, circling around Earth Day. If you don't read your insert in your garbage bill, I'll happily highlight a few of them for you. On May the 7th, there's going to be an event at UVDS, the recycling center. You go in Pistone Winery, so free compost. It's also a hazardous household waste event. This will be perfect as you're preparing for your garage sale as well. When you find stuff, just drive it on up there and bring some compost home. The other thing I wanted to announce is that the JPA was able to get a grant for $91,000 for buying more compost. As everyone remembers me talking about 1383, one of the things we're all putting all of our organics and with our green waste now, and so we have a lot of compost. And the state decided it'd be a good idea if we actually, once we gave it all out, we bought it all back. So we are now getting people used to, as much as we can, using compost. So we're trying to give it away, but there'll be a time when, we'll probably be purchasing it. So when we run out of grants and things like that. Also, we've got I also wanted to announce we do have another new program. It's a coupon you can get, and then you can use that. You just call UVDS if you see, things dumped along the road, or if there's a lot of trash in the creek. Just give them a quick call. And the long gone can and bottle buyback center, we think it's going to be fully in place by June 1. It's up at Clover Flat. So you can take your old mattress up there and take your cans and your bottles, and that will all be coming back. And just our local announcements, Shred It Day is this Friday, 12 to 3, in the back of the community center. And we have a really organized system, we hope. It's only drive-through. We'll take it right out of your trunk and shred it, and then you can drive around, and we'll take your e-waste. So we hope that, we're really requesting that everybody stays in their car, so we have a really efficient system. So we're going to have 2 shredded trucks and 2 e-waste trucks. That's my
Very
update.
good. Thank you. Cal City's update, just very quickly, we actually had an in-person meeting for the North Bay Division or we are going to anyway, on Wednesday, April 27th at Mare Island Brewing Company. That'll be the first time in 2 years that we are meeting in person. Also, I forwarded information to staff today from the National League of Cities. They have a report on a program using American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA funds specifically for small communities, best practices for small communities, non-entitlement units or NEUs, local government. Hopefully that's something that we can look into and see if there's specific funds for small communities like ours I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but we hope so. Any other Cal Cities updates from anybody?
Well, just that the policy committee meetings will be taking place next week also.
Okay. Moving on, Climate Action Committee, we have a meeting aptly timed for this Friday, April 22nd. That's the next time we'll have our Climate Action Committee meeting. Any other ad hoc or standing committee reports? Seeing no others, I just had a couple other things to report out. I did want to recognize the passing of Warren Nelson, who recently died, a council member from 1980 to 84 and mayor from 1984 to 86. We will be adding a proclamation in his honor for our May 3rd agenda. And also, I have been on the county Measure L, or the Fire Prevention Quarter-Cent Sales Tax Measure, on that committee, both helping shape the language of that measure, but also on the committee that is working on public education and outreach. That is going to be on the June 7th ballot. We have been receiving quite a bit of feedback and endorsements as other members of that committee are introducing it around to all the different jurisdictions and stakeholders. So you should be hearing more and more about that potential quarter-cent sales tax that would fund the Community Wildfire Protection Plan and other related wildfire mitigation programs. That's all I have on my list of notes. Any others? Councilmember Knight?
Question and just a quick comment. So for the Measure L, does the Yes on Measure L expect to have a group visit with councils and town councils, city councils, and look for their endorsement for that?
They have been going out. There is a very short time frame for all the work that they need to do. I don't know that they're going to be able to, I mean, the next time we would be meeting in 2 weeks, it's potential. I know they have gone to chambers of commerce, a lot of industry groups, individual elected officials, but I think they have put off going to councils based on just meeting schedules and getting, being able to get all that scheduled. I can certainly follow up and invite them if they want to come and make a presentation at our next council meeting. How is that, Gary? Just want to make sure that we're staying within the legal boundaries of receiving a presentation as a council. One, is that okay? And two, do we need to have representation for and against? Because I know in many of these forums with, either political organizations or other stakeholder groups, they have had both support and opposition represented.
I think when it's a presentation of the council, there isn't a need to do both, but it would need to be agendized.
Not a need to have both,
Correct.
but be on the agenda as any other item, any
Correct.
other presentation.
Yep.
Okay, so we can do that outreach and see if they are available to.
And I would just clarify also, you need to see, receive a presentation is one thing, receive a presentation and have action to endorse it would actually be an additional level that you would have to identify in your agenda if you wanted. If you just want to have the presentation, one thing. If you want to have the presentation and then discuss whether to endorse it, that would require a separate.
I would dare say that they're not interested in just making a presentation, probably. That is part of the public outreach, but they are receiving and actively pursuing endorsements. So if we have that interest, if council agrees to agendize that two-step process for May 3rd, are you making that request of council?
I think I would appreciate hearing the presentation and for the community to hear that presentation as well. So yes, I would support that.
Are you asking that we agendize the potential endorsement of that also?
As well, yes.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at. Is there support from the council to have that? Councilmember Tagliabashi is nodding yes.
Yes, I'll be in support of Councilmember Knight's request. I think that's smart.
Is there,
Yeah, I support it.
okay, so we have at least 3 of us. I would support it as well. You gonna support it?
Well, I'm totally fine with
too late,
them,
but-
with them coming, yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine, but,
We can still
know,
discuss whether
yeah.
there's gonna be a council endorsement or not,
right.
at that
Oh.
meeting.
So that's not a done deal if we put that on the agenda, that we will
No, based
endorse
on
or
No,
not
it would
endorse?
be we would still be voting on that action as a council to either endorse or not.
So the agenda would show a presentation, and then it would show a later potential action item under administrative item for consideration of an endorsement.
And there's no guarantee
Oh.
that it would happen. It's just,
Okay,
it would be on the agenda to make sure
so
people.
a two-step process.
Correct.
I support a two-step process.
Okay, so we will plan on adding that to May 3rd, if they're available to make a presentation, and then also add an agenda item following that to consider a position, I'll just say, a position on Measure O.
Okay.
Any other news, information before we adjourn? Okay, with that, just want to acknowledge it's 4:45.
Yeah.
That's, I know, but the public, we are going to go into closed session. Item 13, we have 3 items in closed session. Gary, is there any expectation of reportable action?
No, there's no expectation of reportable action.
Okay, so the public all gets to adjourn. We will adjourn later.